Again, Chris is running for the office of Superintendent of Public Schools in Washington State, and so we have him here. I'll let him go ahead and tell us a little bit about himself. So, Chris, I just want to welcome you to the show. Thank you for joining us so much. We really appreciate it. And just tell us a little bit about yourself, if you would.
Hey, thanks for having me. What a great opportunity. This is a pretty amazing evolution in what's happening politically in our country. And I feel like when I ran for the legislature 6 years ago, my entire campaign was about income inequality and the particular regressivity of our tax code in Washington. Had the huge support of labor in this. And so to see what has happened in the last 6 years and some of the work that you folks are doing grassroots nationally and in each of the states is pretty powerful. So again, thanks for having me. I'm Chris Reykdal. I'm leaving my House seat in the Washington State Legislature to run for Superintendent of Public Schools, as you heard. The role is pretty straightforward. Our state sends all of the money to our schools through an office that I'm seeking, the superintendent's office, and then out to our local 295 school districts. So there's an enormous need there for financial competency and all that stuff, but also setting policies so that there's equity in our schools, so that districts are getting equal resources, but beyond equal, they're getting resources. And one of the things I think is emerging in our state is that, ironically, more money is following wealthy communities than it is the communities most in need. And so we've got big issues in our state, as do others. Our tax code magnifies it unbelievably. We have the most regressive tax code in the country. We're heavily reliant on sales tax and a business and occupation tax. So if you're a Washington resident, you're very wealthy, you pay less than 3% of your disposable income in taxes because we have no income tax at all or capital gains tax. If you're very low income, if you're a recent immigrant, if you're a struggling family, you pay closer to 16 or 17% taxes in our state. So our entire education system is built on the wrong basis. The people who need the most resources get the least, but they're paying the most into the system. So that's a huge challenge for us, and it's part of the reason I ran. I was born and raised in our state. I went to public schools my whole life. I'm the youngest of 8 kids. We grew up on public assistance, and candidly, it was pretty tough. My oldest 6 siblings spent some time in the foster care system, so I have this real sense that there's a purpose for government to wrap around vulnerable families, and then it's public education that really can lift families out of poverty and give people the opportunity. And that's what broke the cycle for me. That's what gave me the shot that I've had. And so I went on to be a teacher and a school board member. And for the last 14 years, I've been with our community and technical college system. It doesn't get a lot of credit, but they are the workhorse of higher education in our state. And it's a pretty amazing system. So thanks again for having me. I know we'll get into some issues here. That's a little bit about me, but you guys are doing incredible work, and thanks a lot.
Oh, absolutely. We're, again, thankful to have you on, and that's an interesting story, and I appreciate you sharing with us a little bit of background about yourself. And so one of the questions, and you kind of touched on it a little bit in there, and I just wanted to have you expand on it a little bit, is you mentioned the financial competency aspect of it. What roles do you see the superintendent position playing in the education system in our state, and what kind of, and where do you plan on taking it, I suppose?
Yeah, so we can't get to the kind of equity that we need in this state unless we have a really honest conversation about the way we fund our schools. And in Washington State, as some of you know who are online here, we are increasingly dependent on local property taxes. So very wealthy communities pay very low tax rates, but they generate a lot of money per child, and they have incredible opportunities. If you're a rural Washingtonian, or you live in a property-poor community, you have very high tax rates, but you don't generate very much money per child, and so that fundamentally creates inequity. You talk about the need for before-school programs, after-school programs, interventions, family outreach coordinators, all of the stuff we're trying to do with opportunity gaps in race and the LGBTQ community and low-income communities and our tribal communities. All of that opportunity hinges upon getting this revenue question and this finance question right, and we just have a long ways to go. So I've said that at OSPI, given my background in finance, I want to change the conversation, and I want to deliver a bipartisan approach to this thing to the legislature as a starting point so that they feel like somebody in the constitutional office of OSPI is trying to get to a solution here that's more equitable by geography, and by poverty status in our communities. I think I have the background to do that. I'm committed to delivering that plan. It won't be the plan that passes in the end. Partisan politics will be partisan politics, and they'll work on it in the legislature. But I just think we're beyond the era where we all complain about it not working, but then not offering up solution. And I intend to deliver a plan to them if I'm elected.
That's an excellent answer. And I do wonder. I know the economic aspect of it, and you say that basically the reality of the situation is that we don't have a solution immediately on the horizon that's going to get passed through the partisan legislature. So, with knowing that we're only going to be able to address part of that issue, there's also other aspects to the separation in the economics and the education that people are receiving. So with the quality of the educators and the experience of the educators in the different districts and how that plays a role, I'd wonder how is your plan does your plan address some of those aspects of it?
Yeah, that's excellent. So when you dive into this thing, as you just indicated, not only is there an injustice in the tax code and the way we send the money out by district, but we don't have the money necessarily following the greatest need. So where we have the greatest need, we should be thinking about changing formulas and creating incentives. And so classic example is when you're in a high poverty community or a community with low graduation rates, that's the place where we need to be investing and creating incentives for educators to come in, more intensive resources, bringing down student-faculty ratios, more counselor advisors, more parent outreach, candidly, more substance abuse, more family planning efforts. Like the comprehensive whole child stuff has to follow the communities most in need. And so my plan does include that. It's not going to be comfortable for some folks because instead of just rolling out the money based on every single kid who walks through a school door with a backpack, you will see money being driven out to communities that need it the most. I had a role to play this last session in passing what we call our EOG bill, Equal Opportunity Gap bill. It's been years and years in the making. And quite frankly, our communities most impacted by the work we have to do have known what to do for a long time. My job this year was to get some very privileged lawmakers, I think, to understand that there's a big economic incentive for doing the right thing for vulnerable communities. And the message I always tell people is when a kid drops out of school, it's rarely because they can't do math or science. It's because something else is happening in their life. And when they drop out, it's $370,000 in lost lifetime earnings for that individual. And it's another $300,000 impact to taxpayers because of the criminal justice system, the healthcare system, and the social safety net. So as a kid who grew up on public assistance, I was on track to being one of those students who was eventually going to cost myself $400,000 and my fellow taxpayers $300,000. But my community invested in me and invested in other kids who struggle at times, and it made the difference. So you've nailed this. It's not just about getting new money, but it's also getting money in the right places. And I think we can do that if we're sincere about the outcome. The politics of it are enormous, as you well know. But what other fight is more worthy than this one?
Nice. I'm curious about you. You've mentioned your background in growing up in poverty. I'm wondering, and you're mentioning talking about getting the resources out to the communities that need it the most. Oftentimes, what's left out in when that rhetoric is used among the political class in general are communities of color. So, what kind
Mm-hmm.
of personal experiences do you have in communities of color that help you understand what they specifically need beyond the financial resources, but the additional resources that they could be using to better offer or to offer better educations to their students?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question because these conversations are intersectional, as the word has become. You can't talk about poverty without having a more meaningful conversation about race in our state and across the country, about ethnicity, about our LGBTQ friends, um, whether it's homelessness or suicide rates or you name the demographic. These numbers are up in communities most vulnerable, and it goes well beyond poverty, so I appreciate that. So my experience really as a child was not in a tremendously diverse community that I grew up in. It's that through substance or alcohol abuse, my parents eventually got on a recovery program and became sponsors to a lot of folks. And they spent a lot of time, my mom in particular, as a sponsor for other recovering alcoholics, at the Confederated Tribes of the Tulalip. So a lot of interaction with tribal communities up in Snohomish County. It was my first orientation to understanding that though I was poor, I had enormous privilege as a white male. And my parents, I don't think, knew that when they were struggling, but they sure came to understand that as they reached out and helped other vulnerable communities. So that sort of launched a lot of my work. Our community technical college system, as I mentioned, I've been with for 14 years. It is the most diverse higher ed system in the state. And so in that, I've been able to help launch opportunity grants, opportunity scholarships. I got a bill passed for the first time in our state and maybe in the country that gives financial aid specifically to low-income students, particularly rural students, and specifically Latino Hispanic students disproportionately, who are trying to take college credit while they're in high school as a pathway to success, because there are still huge financial barriers even for high school students to do that. So I've tried to bring my privilege to a place where I can bring greater equity to folks, and I've been honored to work in some systems that have done that very well, and quite frankly, with some failure as well. So,
All right. And one of the other questions I wanted to ask before I open it up to the rest of the group is your opponent is Erin Jones, and we spoke with her last week. And one of the questions I had was, what is it that sets you apart from your opponent, and that makes you feel like that you're uniquely qualified to fulfill this role? And then, regardless of the outcome, in what ways do you see that you could possibly work together in accomplishing your common goals?
yeah, that's an excellent question. So what we hear around the state is, wow, what a race. Like, a lot of times people feel in politics like they don't have great choices, and in this, I really think they do. Two very passionate people, pretty, I would say, dynamic speakers, and both coming from an incredible place in their heart that brings them a desire to serve. I'll never touch Erin's cultural competence work and her equity understanding. I don't try. It's not appropriate. What I would say is a difference, though, is if you haven't lived in poverty, if you haven't felt sort of the shame of purchasing things with food stamps and sort of struggle and judgment, it is sometimes hard to relate to 400,000 Washington kids across race and ethnicity who struggle in poverty. And I've lived it, so in some ways I feel like I connect with kids in a way that I think sometimes you can only experience by living it a little bit. The other thing is just experience for that role. We were both in a classroom, Erin for 6 or 8 years and me for less than that even. But the job is chief executive officer, so a graduate degree in finance and years as an executive in the college system and then the policy-making world of the legislature. I think those are huge things when it comes to being successful in that role. And so our experiences are different. I just think she brings a better understanding of local school districts in some cases. I think I bring a much bigger strength and background in actually running as an executive and kind of shaping the culture of a large state agency, interacting with the legislature, and doing it in a way that I think personally connects me with kids who have struggled financially. But two great candidates.